Welcome to Tossing Grenade the Windmills. Windmills.
Hi, my name is Matt Franklin. Tom's mic has died a horrible death, and he's asked me to take over for him for the podcast for a little while. We were introduced through our mutual friend, Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. All right, on to the podcast. This is the novel Grenademan vs. the Zombies by T.C. Ricks. Chapter 1, Part 1. As with most apocalyptic events, the world ended on a bet. Of course, as is often the case, the situation was far more complicated and nuanced than that. It depended on how one defined the word end. It also involved a lot of alcohol, Doritos, and a willing suspension of any disbelief that the parameters of said bet were possible. Funny thing about wagers, though. To some, a wager is as serious as a riddle. Humans spin oaths, wagers, and riddles like they are nothing. But there are older beings and older powers that take these actions seriously. So, when Doc bet Jarvie that he and his friends could survive the zombie apocalypse, declaring that all of the people in those movies were wimps or incompetent cowards, something took notice. The levers and gears of power were set in motion, and soon there were no more words to be said. Now, Jarvie might not have been a creature bound by oaths like robots who followed their programming, but he did take such challenges quite seriously, and he had spent the last 30 days setting out to prove just how stupid Doc really was. Jarvie looked around at the others in the group and smiled. They really had no idea what was in store for them. He particularly hated the smug look on Doc's face. Jarvie said, "I think it's time for you to put up or shut up." Doc scratched the back of his head. He was over 6 feet tall and very solidly muscled. He'd played a lot of football back in college until he injured himself during senior year. Right now he was wearing his trademark quasi-fedora and yellow-tinted 60s-style prescription sunglasses. "Of course, Jarvie. Now remind me how much this wager was for again." Jarvie snarled and pulled out the napkin they'd written the bet on. "You know how much it is, you slacker. It was for $2,000, and I can prove my case. Can you prove yours?" Doc chuckled and looked back at the other 4 in the group who had taken his side. They were a motley crew, all of them, and Jarvie had come to hate them over the years. Beads wasn't unattractive, but with her thick jaw and thicker shoulders, she wasn't Jarvie's type. Not that Jarvie couldn't have any type he wanted at this point. She was practically Doc's fiancée. They just hadn't gotten around to actually doing anything about it. Kevin had that annoying laugh and craning neck that jerked up and down. Hector wasn't there tonight, and then there was Oscar. He hated Oscar most of all, just because of the way he twisted and mocked everything Jarvie said. Oscar had a mouth, and if there was one thing Jarvie couldn't tolerate, it was a man who didn't know his place. Doc said, "I'm prepared. You want to go first?" Doc was always prepared. He was the leader of their pathetic little band. Jarvie had once counted himself amongst their number, but that was before they had rejected him. Jarvie shook his head. "No, I think I would like to see what you have cooked up here." Doc bowed and turned to the others. "I think the time has come to show him the shelter, don't you?" He saluted them, and they cheered back. Doc turned around and looked at Jarvie. "I think you're in for a surprise," he said. "Oh, someone was in for a surprise, all right," Jarvie chuckled to himself. There was a reason he wanted to go last. He followed them down the path on the side of the house, carefully stepping on each of the smooth stones set into the grains of sand. He was thorough. A few moments later, the small crowd had wound its way to Doc's backyard. Tall pine trees stood sentinel next to the path, but the edge of the wooden fence held back a stampeding herd of ash, oak, and yew. Doc's land was like a mini England. Jarvie remembered him mentioning once that his father had been some kind of weird tree aficionado. Typical. Doc motioned Jarvie over to a hill fronted by a thick concrete retaining wall, embedded with a bulky metal door. Doc entered a code on the side of the entrance and twisted the steel airlock until it released with a hiss. The door swung open. Doc gestured, beckoning with his finger to Jarvie as he walked backward into the darkness. There was a clatter of metal and some cursing before Kevin turned on a single light bulb that swung back and forth from the ceiling. Doc grinned proudly and stood amongst piles of cans. "Behold!" Doc waved and turned around triumphantly. It was impressive. Jarvie did have to agree with that. There were piles of canned and dried food all around the hill that went back at least 10 feet, with enough water to last them for months. He followed Doc farther into the darkness, where 2 thick couches were placed in front of a television set. "This here's our zombie protection shelter. We have enough food to last us for 60 days, we have enough water for 90 days, and enough water purification tablets to last for a year. This television is attached to a set of solar panels hidden farther up the hill, in one of the trees." They had several shelves stocked with a wide range of DVDs. At least they would be well entertained at the end of the world. Jarvie couldn't help but smile at himself. He smiled even wider at the bookshelf that contained a wide collection of material from several different authors. Fiction mixed without hesitation amongst thick textbooks and philosophical tomes. It looked like Kevin and Beads had provided most of the books. They both had very eclectic reading tastes. Kevin only liked comic books, and Oscar didn't read. Doc probably read whatever was available. It was odd because while they talked a lot about books, Doc never really spoke to his preference like the others did. Jarvie looked around. He nodded. "And what about weapons?" Doc said, "I've got a pistol and Kevin has a shotgun. Bede has 5 rifles, and between all of us we've got about 4,000 rounds of ammunition." Jarvie stroked his chin speculatively for a moment. "Really? Well, I suppose you'd be far more prepared than most, but that's not really what I'd call the parameters of the bet." Oscar leapt forward. "Sure it is, you jerk. Pay up." Jarvie chuckled. "Really? You expect me to pay you $2,000 for this?" Oscar said, "This stuff costs a lot of money. You better believe I expect you to pay it." Jarvie smirked. Oscar was a green belt in Taekwondo. Of course, he had taken it when he was only 12, but given the pot Jarvie saw on Oscar's 35-year-old belly, he was pretty sure the guy hadn't kept up with it. "I'm sorry, but this doesn't convince me." Doc's smile grew wider. "I don't think you remember the wording of the bet yourself, Jarvie." "Really?" He sighed and took out the napkin. He wanted to read it. He knew Doc thought he was clever. They didn't know Jarvie. They had never known him, but they were going to learn. "Shall I read the napkin?" Doc waved his hand magnanimously and said, "By all means." Jarvie coughed to clear his throat, and then he began to read. "Be it hereby witnessed by the undersigned that the band of the Grey Orc's head does wager Jarmos Almadine that within 30 days they can construct a shelter of sufficient strength to survive a zombie apocalypse. The wager shall consist of $2,000. Judgment shall be rendered on impartial evidence alone, without speculation." Doc and the others were laughing hysterically. Doc picked the napkin out of Jarvie's hand and looked it over. He said, speaking with slow, clear words, enunciating with great exaggeration, "Impartial evidence alone, without speculation." The others were silent during the reading with mock solemnity. They remained silent for a full 30 seconds afterward, until finally they could stand it no longer and broke down laughing. Beads leaned into Kevin, since she could barely keep herself from falling down. Jarvie gave them a thin smile in return. He remained silent even though he knew that this would be seen by them as a sign of fear or capitulation. Doc sighed and shook his head. "Tell me, Jarvie, how exactly are you going to prove that this shelter can't survive a zombie apocalypse?" "I can demonstrate if you like." "Oh, please do. And you'll need to use impartial evidence. I see a physical shelter here. Got zombies?" "I do." Jarvie said it so matter-of-factly that he felt a small stab of satisfaction as Kevin stopped smiling and looked serious. Beads caught it too and elbowed him in the ribs. She said, "Please tell me you're not falling for this." Kevin looked sheepish a moment, and then he looked at Doc, asking, "What if he can?" Doc looked at Jarvie, still laughing, and then back at Kevin's serious face. "Can what?" "What if he can produce zombies?" It was impossible, of course, but Kevin's nervous tone indicated some of the things he had seen Jarvie do in games only seemed impossible, especially when petty vengeance was involved. Jarvie smiled wickedly. "Oh, I can." Doc rolled his eyes and smiled. "Well, this I have to see." Jarvie didn't say anything for a moment. The laughter had slowly stopped. Everyone but Kevin was still smiling. Jarvie looked at Beads and said, "Do you have your guns?" Beads nodded. "I do." "You might want to get them." Beads stopped smiling. "I'm not shooting anybody. What did you do, get a bunch of actors to dress up in zombie outfits or something?" "Something like that." Jarvie smiled. "I'll happily produce my zombies as soon as I leave the shelter. I'm even allowing you time to gather your weapons, unless you want to call off the bet, of course." Doc sighed. He looked with great weariness towards the others and said, "Jarvie never knows when to quit. All right, get the stuff. I'm not giving up until he does." Oscar went right up to Jarvie and looked like he was about to hit him. "Beads spent half of her paycheck on this stuff, you bastard. You better pay up." Doc put a hand on Oscar's muscular shoulder. "Calm down, Oscar, it's fine. You have to know Jarvie. He's just messing with your head. He's a jerk sometimes, but he never backs down from a wager, never. We just need to call his bluff." Oscar stared at Jarvie a few more minutes, and then looked at Doc. He clenched his jaw, but walked back with the others to the cars parked in front of the house. A thin, cool wind blew down from the north, causing the trees to sway back and forth. The leaves were turning gold, but there was still enough green that it looked like a forest instead of a graveyard. The air smelled wrong, though, and the clouds had turned just the wrong shade of gray. Kevin started to feel very nervous. He always wiped his nose when he was nervous. That was why Kevin always lost at cards. They formed a small bucket brigade, bringing the last of their supplies from Oscar's pickup truck to the door. They performed the task with silent resilience. They had no real idea what was in store for them. They worked well as a team, and Jarvie had never fit. It was one of the things he hated about them. Jarvie waited outside until all of them were inside the shelter with the door firmly and carefully shut. Once they were safely locked in, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a well-worn leather tome and opened it. He began to read.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson. Copyright 2012, Red Anvil Amalgamated.
To fight the forces of evil!